And what he's done is he's created a lot of new stories, reformatted, modified a lot of stories to communicate this idea. And he then sets all of this on the lips of someone who's supposed to look like they're an eyewitness of the life of Jesus, who has seen the life of Jesus unfold, who has heard the words of Jesus. It's not clear when this figure is writing the text, although it's possible that the author wants the text to look pseudo-historical. There's one interesting detail in the text.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Hugo Méndez. And for those that are unfamiliar with him, in 2006, Hugo Méndez received his Bachelor's of Arts in English at Southern Adventist University. In 2009, he received a Master's of Arts in Religion and a PhD in Linguistics in 2013, both from the University of Georgia. And he is currently an Associate Professor in Ancient Mediterranean Religions at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In today's topic, we'll be focusing on his 27-lecture course with Bart Ehrman titled The New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible. So welcome to History by Podcast, Professor Hugo Méndez.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what this course is about?
Yeah, so the course is entitled, as he said, The New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible. And this is being done through Bart Ehrman's Biblical Studies Academy. The idea here is to teach academic quality courses online. So this is a chance for students to come into my classroom virtually in some way. These are the same lectures that I give to my students, my undergraduate students here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is the same class I train my graduate students to teach. Across 27 lessons, we'll be looking at the entire New Testament. We'll be looking at the Gospels, the epistles. We'll be studying questions of authorship and date. We'll be exploring their literary design. We'll be dealing with questions like, how do we tell whether these texts are actually authentic, whether they come from the authors they claim? There's a whole variety of issues that we'll be dealing with, questions of interpretation, especially around very difficult books like John and Revelation. And so there's a lot here for people who are interested in the Bible, interested in the New Testament in particular, who want to get a kind of university academic critical flavor of New Testament studies.
How do scholars such as yourself go about determining the authenticity of text? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. As I kind of tell my students, so on the one hand, we have to recognize that in the ancient world, there are inauthentic texts being produced all the time. There are pseudepigrapha, what we might, kind of loosely categorize as forgeries today, floating around. We know that this literature exists. We know that it's widespread, and we've been able to identify it in lots of different places in classical literature. The challenge is that once an author sticks a false name onto a text or makes a false authorial claim, they pushed the football over the 50-yard line. Like forever after, people who encounter that particular false name, false claim, are kind of on the defensive, having to prove that it is in some ways false. What scholars do is they look at a variety of features, no one of which can really solve the case in any way. So on the one hand, we're interested in differences in writing style from an author's otherwise authentic, attested writings, right? So that's one major concern. Do we see differences in the linguistic style of the text? We're interested in differences in ideology. It's true that an author's thought can develop over the course of their career, but if you couple differences in ideas with differences in language, you're probably getting closer to actually the bullseye of finding an author who might be misrepresenting themselves in a text. Another thing is that we know that individuals who engaged in pseudepigraphy, literary forgery in antiquity are often imitating models, right? If you want to write a letter attributed to Plato, you want to study lots of Plato's writings, and you want to be able to imitate his style to throw people off the scent that you're someone else. And so we get very interested as scholars in places where we find linguistic borrowing, where we find clear signs that a person has copied text, phrases, clauses verbatim, maybe recombined them in interesting ways. Signs of literary dependence suggest to us more so the craft of an imitator than someone simply just speaking again, right, in any kind of original new text. I'll say another one that's really interesting. I think coupled with the three that I've mentioned, it's also very telling sometimes when we find texts that seem anxious about pseudepigraphy, that seem to have some sort of obvious concern or anxiety around this particular practice. So Second Thessalonians is a letter that we attribute to Paul. And Second Thessalonians has Paul say not to be shaken, he tells his audience not to be shaken by a letter as if it were from us. He condemns false texts, forgeries that are floating around. The trick is that the author of Second Thessalonians, we think, isn't Paul. We think that he's somebody who is trying to position himself as Paul, and that anxiety about pseudepigraphy or forgery in the air in his letter probably reflects his own anxieties as an author, an imitator trying to get this text across. A much clearer place to see this is in the Apostolic Constitutions. This is this 4th century text in which the voices of the apostles go ahead and deliver all sorts of ritual instructions and 4th century ordination rules, as if they were actually doing this in the 1st century. And in that text, multiple times, you will see the apostles condemn books falsely authored in our names, when in fact, this is clearly not a text that was written by the apostles. Not a single Christian today thinks this was a text written by the apostles, but it shows that same sort of anxiety around pseudepigraphy. So in isolation, none of these will crack the case, but when you start to put them together, probabilistically, you build the likelihood that the person who's actually writing this text may not be the author they claim they are. The final, of course, critical piece is if you can find anachronisms, right? Things that just seem historically out of time.
How would you respond to those that try to defend texts like Second Thessalonians or First, Second Timothy, Titus as Pauline, and they'll say, "Well, the changing in writing style is because Paul's writing style changed. Why can't someone's writing style change over the course of their life, and why can't someone change their theological views over the course of their life?"
Yeah, I think in that case, that's a very actually natural inference to make. There's actually nothing wrong with that inference that looking at two texts and seeing differences, I think the first place a scholar should go is the thought that this could simply represent a development of Paul's thought or a development of Paul's language. But again, it's the correlation of multiple features that becomes problematic. It's one thing to say that Paul's ideas shifted over time. Plausible. But when that also maps over linguistic changes, okay, now you have to have that extra layer of thinking, well, apparently Paul's style changed, or he's receiving other kinds of editorial assistance or something, and you have to, be content with both of those things. I think you can be. But it's then when you stack, in the case of Second Thessalonians, some pretty clear examples in the text of literary borrowing, places where you find verbatim sentences more or less reproduced, that you start to kind of ask yourself the question, why has the ideology changed? Why has the language changed? In a way that also correlates with signs of direct copying from Paul's other letters. Why would Paul be copying another one of his letters so much later on when apparently his ideas and language have changed so much? You get to the anxieties then about pseudepigraphy, and you throw that into the picture. When did Paul become so concerned about pseudepigraphy all of a sudden? And again, what you're doing is you're slowly building a probabilistic case. I think when apologists or even more conservative scholars will do the kind of move you say, when they'll do something where they try to take that one criterion and they'll try to break down, well, the language doesn't really matter because you can imagine language evolving. They like to do this divide and conquer with what's really a cumulative aggregate argument that's fundamentally a question of probabilities. And I don't really particularly enjoy that approach. I don't think it does our historical text justice and our historical processes, justice.
So now I'd like to ask you about the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is understood by some to suggest that it was written by an eyewitness, but in John 21, it's also could be understood as a little vague. It says, "And we know it is the testimony of the beloved disciple," something like that, as if it's like it's a group of people writing the text, distinguishing themselves from the beloved disciple. So
Mhm.
what's going on there? Are they trying to claim that the material they have possession of is authentic to the beloved disciple? And if so, does that make this a forgery?
Yeah, so there are a few concerns a little bit with John. So there are three verses that are relevant for the authorial claim of John. One of them is chapter 1, verse 14, where we get in the very classic articulation, "And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory." So in that text, the author says the word became flesh, dwelled in our midst, right, is here on earth, and we have seen his glory. He speaks in a we, and specifically positions himself as someone who saw Jesus when he dwelled on earth in his earthly life. So, right at the front of John, this kind of very natural place for an authorial identification, you get the idea that this figure is an eyewitness. The next major verse that really matters is probably 1935. So, across the second half of John, you've seen this character emerge in the text, this disciple whom Jesus loved. He's a highly idealized character. He, when all the other disciples abandon Jesus, stays with Jesus up to the moment of his crucifixion. He's there standing under the cross. Jesus even gives him his own mother to take care of. This kind of subtle symbolic sign that he's also become a brother to Jesus in the theology of the book. But in any event, this figure is there. And in John 19:35, we get this statement. The one who's, let me actually pull this up here for a second, just so I can get, the nice text there. "He who saw this has testified so that you may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth." This is worded in the third person, but the masculine pronoun here, masculine, forms here in a verse where there's one male figure present who is seeing all of this unfold, the disciple whom Jesus loves, gives us this strong impression that this is the disciple whom Jesus loved, speaking about himself. The point that he who saw this has testified so that you might believe basically brings us into what the purpose of the book is. In chapter 20, verse 31, the book will say that specifically, this book was written so that you might believe. The author here is essentially positioning this character as testifying so that you might believe, aligning him with the author, essentially co-opting him with the author. Since the author has already identified himself as an eyewitness, or potentially, if you want to take that we as a group of eyewitnesses, it's pretty clear that the disciple would at least be one member of this group. But that next phrase, "his testimony is true," or the next few clauses, "his testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth," is speaking very much from the interior life and mind of the disciple. This seems to be, in 1935, an author speaking in the third person about himself, claiming that he's testifying, aligning this testimony with the purpose of the book. This seems to be a crystal clear clue that this figure is supposed to be understood as the disciple of Jesus loved, is supposed to be understood as the author of the text. Now, we think as scholars that chapter 21 in particular was probably added later to the text. Although there has been some pushback on this idea in recent years, I'd still venture to say that a majority of scholars of John still think chapter 21 was added later. And it's in chapter 21 that you get that verse that you mentioned. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true, very evocative of 1935. But there are also other things Jesus did. If any one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that were written. Now, it's true that there's a difference a little bit in terms of the kind of pronouns or forms here, really. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things, the text says, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, I know there are some scholars who read this verse who think that whoever the we has to be different from the disciple. So we know that this person's testimony is true, but the we can't be the he. The problem with that is that when you look at ancient literature, it's very common for narrators to slip in and out of first person I references, first person we references, third person references. You can look at the writings of Josephus, you can look at the writings of Polybius, and you'll see these really fascinating sorts of slippages, clause by clause, sentence by sentence, in which they'll move between these forms. One of the reasons is that ancient narrators liked third person forms because they gave the kind of air of authenticity. But first person forms would be natural in other sorts of framing settings. Another kind of, I think, key factor is when we recall that chapter 21 was added later to the text and that it clearly seems to be modeled off 1935, off John 1:14 and its use of we, off 20:31. And you can line up the text and see that it's kind of a bricolage, a mosaic of pieces of those verses. I think it's more likely that we're looking at another hand here who has decided to imitate, capture the fluid we voice, third person voice of the narrator who speaks in the first 20 chapters of John, and then sort of folds in his own I voice. So I think that's the most comprehensive way to make sense of that particular sentence, and I think it fits better what we're seeing in chapters 1 through 20. I certainly would not be alone. I think this is the majority opinion among Johannine scholars.
And isn't there a 4th century CE manuscript of the Gospel of John that's missing John 21?
There isn't. Not really. So what happened was we've had two manuscripts that have been suggested as possibilities. One of them is a Coptic text that arguably might show evidence that, in some ways it didn't include the text of John 21, but there's been very little traction that's followed that article. I don't know that the scholarly community at large has found that evidence extremely convincing, especially I think when it's just one Coptic text somewhere. And sometimes in dealing with these manuscripts, it can be, some things are kind of up to judgment. A more recent case was Brent Nongbury had suggested that another particular manuscript of John was lacking the final chapter. But after he published his article, within, as I recall, a week of that article being published, someone else made a response online noting that that was probably not the best interpretation of the manuscript. And to Brent Nongbury's incredible credit, he actually said, yeah, I think that person's explanation is better than the one I gave in the article. I would retract that idea. I think it's wonderful when scholars can have that kind of open-mindedness, and are willing to say I was wrong. And Nongbury did himself, I think, great favors in that situation. So at present, we don't have good manuscript evidence that chapter 21 is a later edition. What we do have is the internal literary evidence that I still think points in that direction very solidly. Redundant endings, slight differences in style, coupled with the fact that this text appears in a soft spot, the very end of a book, a natural place for a later scribe to add extra material. You could think about the multiple endings of Mark and the way that you can always tack things on at the end of a text, especially if you have extra space on that roll, on that codex. The combination of factors there, I think, is really good for 21 being secondary, irrespective of the manuscript history not quite giving us enough data. Of course, all our manuscripts are fragmentary before the 4th century, right? We don't really have a clean picture of a lot of this.
When was John 21 added to the Gospel?
So chapter 21, I think, has to have been added sometime probably in the early second century. Certainly, by the time that we pick up later writers talking about John, it seems pretty clear that a lot of them seem to know John with chapter 21. So I think it has to be very early in its history. When exactly it is, I don't know. I've argued in print that the author of First John very clearly knows the gospel and has imitated its language. It's just really hard to kind of see, I think, definitive proof in First John that he knows a copy of John with chapter 21. Some scholars have made that case. I'm not entirely, convinced by the arguments. I'm not necessarily trying to put up a tough case against it. But I think that's the safest date.
So potentially John 21 could have been added hypothetically after the letter First John was written.
Yeah, that's theoretically possible, because I also think that First John probably is very clearly early second century, and the reason for that is that Eusebius in book 3 of the church history tells us that Papias, who is probably writing around the year 130, give or take, uh, quotes testimonies from First John. So somewhere in the year 130, pardon, it looks like an ancient Christian author is citing First John. That would put First John in the early second century. That means they're probably being produced around the same time. I think it'd be hard to really kind of tell which one came first without stronger evidence.
So is the author of John trying to remake the passion narrative in the Synoptics and pushing this back to the decade that Jesus was crucified? Trying to push back the theology, the story to that time period.
Can you ask that question again?
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is does the Gospel of John know the Synoptics, and is he trying to create a new passion narrative and retroject it back to Jesus' time?
Yeah. Or right. So I think that John definitely knows the synoptics to that first part of the question. I think John has created a gospel that very clearly shows it knows Mark, Matthew, Luke. At the very least, it knows the rough shape of these gospels. And the reason is, it has that same structure as Mark, right? It begins with the baptism of Jesus, it ends with the resurrection. This is not the only way to tell the Jesus story, to structure it that way, to devote half of the book to the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus's life. This is a very Markan way of telling the story that Matthew and Luke are going to reproduce. I think when you get into the weeds too, you can see signs in minor details that the author of John probably knows the individual texts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I think that's all there. I also think, kind of the second point, that yes, the Gospel of John certainly is trying to rework the synoptic passion narrative, among other narratives of these Gospels. I think that, it's very clear he knows the feeding of the 5,000. Obviously he knows other sorts of particular moments in the life of Jesus from the synoptics. He's chosen to write a gospel, and I'll make this argument in my next book, The Gospel of John, A New History. He's chosen to write a gospel where he, in some ways, inserts himself in and around the tradition of the synoptics, but sometimes overlaps with the synoptics. The feeding of the 5,000 is a great example. But he has significantly modified all of this material, and I think probably invented new materials to try to actually hit on his essential purpose. His purpose is to communicate a vastly different theological system than the one we find in the synoptics. He communicates a set of ideas about Jesus, that Jesus is divine, that he came to earth, that Jesus as spirit has given us the spirit that will make us spirits ourselves. This is, John 3 with Nicodemus, that we have a pneumatic existence, an existence of spirit. He communicates the idea in the gospel that he will dwell in humans and humans will dwell in him spiritually, that through this mutual indwelling, they will have celestial access, that they will be able to be with him where he is with the Father, in the heavens, in the world above. He has the idea expressed throughout the text that one receives eternal life through that. One becomes a child of God. One experiences oneness with God. And I think in several verses, I've been very persuaded by the arguments of scholars like Andrew Byers, to some extent Michael Gorman, that this is also a concept of deification. That he believes that just as Jesus is divine, he bequeaths through this life as spirit divine attributes, divine life to human beings, so that there is this kind of becoming angelic beings or becoming godlike beings in this text. So I think that's the theology John wants to do. And what he's done is he's created a lot of new stories, reformatted, modified a lot of stories to communicate this idea. And he then sets all of this on the lips of someone who's supposed to look like they're an eyewitness of the life of Jesus, who has seen the life of Jesus unfold, who has heard the words of Jesus. It's not clear when this figure is writing the text, although it's possible that the author wants the text to look pseudo-historical. There's one interesting detail in the text where right at the beginning of chapter 5, the author describes that there are in Jerusalem 5 porticos, and there's kind of this question about, were these destroyed in the destruction of the temple? If they were, then that could be a sign that he wants to set this, maybe not in the life of Jesus, but certainly in the decades before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. If, on the other hand, they survived, then this might be just kind of a sign that he's writing at whatever period. I leave both options open in my next book.
Is there a link between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that's one of the questions that our field has to do a better job of answering. So historically, the Gospel of John was attributed to John, the son of Zebedee, one of the disciples of Jesus. And this was, I think, a very early Christian inference. Looking at the text, trying to figure out who this figure was, it wasn't very hard to start deducing that he might be John. If this disciple whom Jesus loved is Jesus' closest, most intimate disciples, one of them, right, the Synoptics tell us that there are 3 such figures. There's Peter, James, and John. They're the ones that go up with him on, the Mount of Transfiguration. They're the ones who are with him in Gethsemane. And if you're reading the text, well, Peter can't be this figure because the beloved disciple appears with Peter in certain scenes. That leaves James and John, and it might be relevant then that Acts tells us that James died really not long after Jesus died. And so if you thought of, well, what's the one figure who could have written a text that surfaces decades later, theoretically that would be John. And so I think this is a very quick deduction to make. I think a lot of Christians made it. The question then is, how does this relate to Revelation, which expressly claims to be written by someone named John? Scholars also question, who is this John? Is it just anybody named John? Is this supposed to be John, the son of Zebedee? Is it someone falsely writing in the name of John, the son of Zebedee? My own view is that the Gospel of John likely precedes Revelation. There are a lot of questions around the dating of Revelation. There are people who like to date it early, people who like to date it later. I think that there's a good likelihood that both texts come from around the turn of the 2nd century. That could be 5 years apart, 10 years apart, 20 years apart. I'm not really sure. But I think it's very likely that someone like the author of Revelation could have been reading a copy of John, the Gospel of John, right? And has decided to co-opt that character on some level. It's interesting to me that early on in Revelation, right in the framing section, the one place where you expect an author to make an authorial claim, the figure, the person who's speaking in Revelation claims that he's John and claims that he has testimony and claims and speaks about the word of God and does these expressions that feel very Johannine. Now, it's just in that one section, but it gives the text initially a flavor that seems to connect it back to the vocabulary of the gospel. From there, Revelation does its own thing. It just kind of moves in its own direction. And that's not unusual necessarily for a text that might want to co-opt a previous author. In the mid-second century, Sethian Gnostics are going to produce the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John. Right at the beginning, the author is going to position himself as John. He's going to clearly try to connect himself back to the gospel. It's clear the Apocryphon of John knows the gospel. But when you read most of the Apocryphon of John, it doesn't feel like the gospel at all. It doesn't have any kind of strong, really strong similarities to the gospel's thought or its usual modes of expression. I think something could be similar for Revelation if it's a later Johannine pseudepigraphon, a text that co-opts the voice of this author, but takes him on a very different kind of adventure and a very different kind of genre with a very different agenda in mind. So I'll leave this possibility there in my next book, and I'm really excited to kind of see how that will play with the scholarly community.
And then my final question, how do scholars reconstruct the beliefs and theological thoughts of early Christians?
Yeah, well, by reading their own writings, and by probably a lot of careful debate and interpretation, right? It's hard sometimes because when you read these texts, it's so hard not to infuse your own agendas, biases, to have also to struggle with your own limitations, the limitations of how distant we are from these authors, from the fact that we as readers are struggling with language that's always ambiguous, right? Always open to interpretation. So, in modern language fields like English and comparative lit, we're very well aware that there's that kind of Gadamer expression, right? Fusion of horizons, that the author meets the reader and interpretation happens somewhere in between. I think our task as historians of early Christianity who want to extract early Christian beliefs and ideas from these texts, what we have to do is we have to be very attentive readers of these texts, very carefully working through, if you will, exegesis of these texts, trying to lay aside as many of our own biases, as many of the limitations of our own agendas. That means immersing ourselves in the literature of that period, trying to understand all of the intellectual coordinates that are still available for us to study, to begin to contextualize what we see in the text. And hopefully we can do a good job finding readings that are plausible for that author, plausible at that time, that fit the text that we have. And then the fun of it is, we get this kind of unique window or glimpse into the diversity, the creativity of early Christian beliefs. That's really the most rewarding part of this whole exercise.
And just a reminder to everyone watching, the link to purchase the course is in the description below, and it is also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Hugo Méndez.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.